So we're now going to talk about the structure and functionality of the client portion of the QuoteServices app case study. And this is really interesting. It's not like the other stuff we've looked at up to this point because it's going to be using Retrofit. And I'll talk about what Retrofit is in a second. So we're going to have a class we call QuoteClient, and that performs synchronous remote method invocations on an API gateway. Oh, that's the other difference, too. I should have gone back and said, the other difference here is, unlike the previous example, the client doesn't talk directly to the microservices. It talks through an API gateway. So we'll get a chance to see how that works. So the client is going to essentially have a proxy that's auto-wired. It's a component, so it can do various injections. We've got the proxy. We'll take a look at what the proxy is in a second. The main difference between this proxy and proxies we've looked at up to this point is that the bulk of this proxy is generated automatically. So you have a lot less to do on your side, which is kind of cool. And then we have a couple of methods that actually do the work. So what's going to happen here is this proxy is we're going to do a couple things here. First, we're going to have a component that's going to be used in order to auto-wire the REST template. That's one thing we're going to do. And we're also going to see how that's going to connect to the API gateway, not to the microservices. So the REST template is only going to be used to talk to the API gateway, and then the API gateway will be responsible for sending the request on to the next microservice it's destined for. So we have a getQuotes method that will go ahead and get a list of quotes. And we have a search quote method, which sends over a list of search queries, and they'll do the processing. So now let's go ahead and talk about the structure and functionality of the Quote API interface. This is the really cool part. So the Quote proxy, as we're going to see in a second, is going to use an auto-generated Retrofit API class to abstract out the details of making remote invocation calls using HTTP. And if you want to learn how to do this, you should go watch the video I posted this weekend about how you can use ChatGPT to automatically generate this interface for you, which is super cool. It's a really fun video. I had a lot of fun doing it. And the interesting part of this is, up to this point, you notice we've always been doing manually developed client proxies. We write the code with URI components builder and query param and build and toURI string and all this good stuff. And quite honestly, I just never had time to learn the Retrofit APIs. That's why we've been doing them written by hand. But this weekend, I was like, I wonder if I can get ChatGPT to teach me how to do this really fast. And not only did it teach me how to do it, it did it for me. And so the code you're seeing here was actually generated by ChatGPT. So Quote API is an interface, and you can see what it has here is it's got these methods defined that are very, very similar to the ones you would expect to see in the controller. So the base controller we've been looking at. These are basically the same methods with the same types of information, more or less the same information we would see in the base controller. And I was able to get ChatGPT to do that for me. I cut and pasted in the base controller, endpoint handler methods. I said, strip out the comments and then generate for me a Retrofit interface, which it did. And then I asked it a few more questions, and I got it to add a few more things that I needed to have for this. But it was able to do that automatically. And if you watch the video, you'll see just how ridiculously seamless and trivial it was. So for your next assignment, you're welcome to use ChatGPT to do the same thing. I'm not going to give you the API interface. You're going to have to write it. Or you can tell ChatGPT to generate it automatically. So you can do it either way. So that's kind of fun. So these are the proxy methods that mimic the signatures of the controller methods. And you can see it's got some annotations here that are interesting. We'll talk about them when we look through the code in more detail. Now let's take a look at the Quote proxy class. Remember, the Quote proxy was where we used to write a lot of the code manually. But now we're going to just basically write some very simple boilerplate code that calls the API class generated by Retrofit. And of course, we have this auto-wired mechanism here that will basically connect things together. And here's the bean that does this. So this is the bean that creates the Quote API Retrofit interface. And I won't walk through all these steps right now. We'll take a look at them when we look at the code in more detail. But in a nutshell, what this is doing is it's saying, make me a new Retrofit builder, give it the gateway base URL, add a converter so it knows how to handle JSON, build the class, and then connect it with the Quote API class. And once again, all that code was generated by ChatGPT. When I gave it the interface and told it to generate the API, Retrofit API, I then said, please tell me how to initialize this thing. Boom, that's what it did. So it generated that code. Of course, it left a placeholder for the gateway base URL because it didn't know that that's what I wanted to do. But it had a comment that said, add your base URL here. So that was really helpful. And I should also point out, when we look at the actual code later, you'll see it's very extensively documented. All those comments came straight out of ChatGPT. So there is no longer any excuse for not having comments in your code, because you can use ChatGPT to generate them for you. So what's not to like? This is what the proxy actually looks like. So this is just kind of boilerplate code. You have to write it. You could probably automate it too. In fact, ChatGPT will automatically generate this code for you as well if you ask it to. I wrote it because it was really easy to do and I wanted to comment it myself. But basically where we have here is we have a getQuotes method that takes a string called a route. A route is just the name of the microservice that we're generating, that we're trying to interact with, followed by the quote IDs, followed by the flag that says, is this parallel or not? And you can see how what we do is we call mQuoteAPI, which is this thing here that we auto-wired from this factory method, this bean. And so it goes ahead and gets a response. And the response is basically a call, it's a response object. And we do this by executing this. This runs things synchronously. There's also an asynchronous variant, which we don't use. So it gets it back synchronously. And then we check to see whether or not the response succeeded. And if it did, then we go ahead and return the body, which is the list of quotes. If not, we do something else. I'm not going to talk much about what else we do, but there's other things you can do. So super duper cool example. Certainly demonstrates, without much ambiguity, the power of interacting with your Jarvis-like programming assistant to figure out and teach you stuff, and then actually not just teach you, but actually do a lot of the stuff for you. Now, of course, the trick is to know how to ask the right questions. And the second trick is to know when the results you get back from ChatGPT are just wrong. So this is not going to put us out of work anytime soon, because it gives you back a lot of wrong answers at the moment. But what it demonstrates is that people who know how to use these types of tools, especially as they get integrated into integrated development environments, are going to be way, way, way more productive, and ideally also way more productive and able to write better code and more reliable code and more reusable code and so on than you would if you had to try to remember all these things in the back of your mind, which is hard if you've never seen how to do this stuff before. So that's the end of the discussion of the structure and functionality of the client. What we'll do next time is we're going to take a look at the implementation of all this stuff, and you'll see how it actually works in practice. And it's super cool and very interesting and very production quality style way of doing clients with Spring.